The alarm went off as usual. You reached over to turn it off, but instead of hitting the button, you accidentally knocked it off the nightstand. You quickly picked it up and noticed that a small piece of the plastic casing had cracked. Fortunately, it wasn't a big problem. You grabbed a tube of super glue from a drawer, applied a tiny drop to the broken piece, and within seconds, everything looked as good as new. But while trying to clean the glue off your fingers, a strange question crossed your mind. If this glue is powerful enough to bond plastic, wood, fabric, and even skin within seconds, why doesn't it stick to the tube it comes in? At first it sounds like a simple question, but the more you think about it, the stranger it becomes. After all, glue doesn't know it's inside a container. It doesn't know when to start working or when to stop. So why can it sit inside a tube for months without sticking to anything, then suddenly become incredibly adhesive the moment it comes out? Most people have a ready-made explanation. Some assume that glue containers are made from a special material that glue simply can't stick to. And honestly, that sounds pretty reasonable. But there's one small problem. If you take a strong adhesive and apply it to a piece of plastic similar to the plastic used in many glue containers, it will usually stick just fine. The same goes for metal. In fact, some glue tubes are partially made from metal, and glue can easily bond to metal surfaces. So it's clear that the secret isn't hidden in the material of the container. What if manufacturers coat the inside of the tube with some kind of protective layer? Interesting idea, but that's not the answer either. Think about it. If every company had to apply a special coating to millions of containers just to stop the glue from sticking, production would become far more expensive and complicated than necessary. And the funny thing is, they don't need to do that at all, because the glue isn't actually trying to stick while it's inside the tube, and that's where the real story begins. When we hear the word glue, we naturally imagine a substance that is always ready to stick things together. But most adhesives don't work that way. In reality, they're materials waiting for the right conditions before they can do their job. Take ordinary white glue as an example, the kind most of us used in school. White glue is made of polymers mixed with water, and the water isn't just an extra ingredient. It's one of the main reasons the glue doesn't stick while it's inside the bottle. As long as the water remains there, the glue stays in a liquid state, and while it's in that state, its adhesive properties are extremely limited, but the moment it's exposed to air, something important begins to happen. The water slowly starts to evaporate. As the water disappears, the polymer molecules move closer together. Eventually, they form a solid, sticky layer capable of holding materials together. In other words, the glue doesn't become sticky because it leaves the container. It becomes sticky because the environment around it changes. That's why manufacturers seal glue containers so carefully. The less exposure to air, the longer the glue stays usable. But now another question appears. That explanation works for white glue. What about the super glue we use to repair the alarm clock? Its story is completely different. In fact, what makes super glue work is almost the opposite of what happens with ordinary glue. And surprisingly, air still plays the leading role, just in a completely different way. If you opened a tube of super glue and looked inside, you wouldn't find a substance waiting to lose water before it becomes sticky. Instead, you'd find chemical compounds that are already very close to reacting. And here's the surprising part. These compounds don't need to get rid of water. They actually need a tiny amount of it, a quantity so small that you probably wouldn't even notice it. And that's where humidity comes in. The air around us isn't completely dry. There's always some water vapor floating in it. Most surfaces we touch also contain microscopic traces of moisture, even human skin. That's exactly why super glue sticks to your fingers so easily. Your skin provides almost everything it needs to begin reacting. The moment the glue leaves the tube and comes into contact with air or a slightly moist surface, a rapid chemical reaction begins. Within seconds, it transforms from a liquid into a hard, incredibly strong bond. That's why it often feels like magic. But there's nothing magical about it. It simply found the conditions it needed to do its job. Now let's step back for a moment. If air is responsible for activating most adhesives, why doesn't the glue inside the container eventually go bad? After all, no container is perfectly sealed forever, right? And the answer is yes. That's exactly why glue has an expiration date.
If you keep a tube of glue for years, you'll probably notice that it doesn't perform the way it used to. Sometimes it becomes thicker, sometimes parts of it begin to harden, and sometimes the entire tube dries out. That's because tiny amounts of air or moisture can slowly make their way inside over time. Manufacturers simply design the packaging to make that process as slow as possible, slow enough that the glue remains usable for a long time before any noticeable changes occur. And glue isn't the only material that works this way. Think about a can of paint. What happens if you leave it open? Sooner or later, a dry layer begins forming on the surface. Not because the paint suddenly broke, but because exposure to air started changing its properties. The same thing happens with varnishes, inks, and many industrial coatings. A surprising number of products remain stable inside their containers.
Yet the moment they're exposed to air, everything starts to change. Which brings us to a simple thought experiment. Imagine opening a bottle of regular glue and leaving it uncovered on your desk. Would the entire bottle turn into a solid block within minutes? Not really. In most cases, only the top layer starts changing first, because it's the part most exposed to the air. Over time, that process gradually moves downward. That's why when glue or paint is left open for too long, you often find a dry layer on top while some of the material underneath remains liquid. Eventually, though, enough exposure will ruin the entire container. Now that we know why glue doesn't stick inside its own tube, there's one final practical question. What if it sticks to you? Because for most people, that's the part they care about most. If super glue gets on glass, metal, wood, or similar surfaces, acetone can often be used to dissolve it, but it should be used carefully. If the glue gets on your skin, it's usually best not to force it off. Many people make that mistake. They try pulling the glue apart aggressively and end up damaging their skin more than the glue ever would. In most cases, warm water, soap, and a little patience are enough. As your skin naturally moves, the bond gradually weakens and begins to separate. And if glue gets into your eyes or another sensitive area, it's always better to handle the situation carefully and seek proper medical advice rather than experimenting with random solutions. In the end, the question we started with seemed incredibly simple. Why doesn't glue stick to the inside of its own container? But the answer reveals something fascinating. Glue doesn't have an on and off switch. There's no magical substance protecting the tube from the inside. It's simply chemistry waiting for the right conditions. And for most adhesives, air is what gives the signal to begin. That's why glue can sit quietly inside a container for months, then transform into one of the strongest bonding materials we use in everyday life within just a few seconds. Now here's a question for you. If you left a tube of glue open for an entire week, do you think only the top layer would harden, or would the entire tube turn into one solid block? Think about it.